Center here at the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. Know the power that is peace. Paul Hutton, why is there a cemetery here?
Well, Brian, in 1879, the government established this national cemetery here. Part of it was to recognize what had happened on this battlefield, but also the idea was to bring in the soldiers from the various forts that had been established in the West in the so-called Indian Wars. And when those posts were closed, they brought the bodies here and buried them. Eventually, of course, it became a national veteran cemetery, and that's where we stand today.
Where are we in the United States?
We are in the state of Montana. We are in the Crow Reservation on the federal reservation portion of that, which is the Little Bighorn National Monument.
So if someone's never been here, we'll have a map on the screen to show where Montana is. What's the closest town to here?
Well, Hardin would be the closest town. The closest city would be Billings, Montana.
And what's behind you? What direction are we looking in right behind you?
Well, we're sort of looking to the north and to the west behind us.
And about 100 yards to our right, in a tent down here, is Don FIXIO from the University of Kansas. Professor FIXIO, 7 minutes before we went on the air yesterday, or tried to go on the air yesterday, I guess the best way to put it, all hell broke loose right here. The clouds unleashed rain and thunder and lightning, and that went on for some time. And you said to me as we were walking around, there's a reason for this. What did you mean by that?
Well, perhaps that there's sometimes there's forces of nature that are greater than man, forces that we just can't control.
Anything to do with black elk?
Well, perhaps with the rain yesterday, it might have been the tears of black elk. We really don't know, but I think we just have to kind of keep in mind that the laws of nature are much greater than the laws of man.
Who was Black Elk?
Black Elk was a holy man of the Oglala people, and it was through him that we're able to understand quite a bit about the incidents of the Little Bighorn battle, and about Native people and their beliefs through his people's eyes.
A couple of days ago, we were down at Mount Rushmore. We were in Custer County. And if you read your history, you know that that had something to do with why we're here, the Black Hills and the yellow metal, they called it, I guess. Explain that to us.
It was thought that, a rumor that there might be gold in the Black Hills, and so an expedition was put together in which George Armstrong Custer supervised that expedition. And it's interesting about rumor that sometimes all you have to do is just whisper the rumor of gold, and certainly that stirred up a lot of action and expedited the movement coming into this part of the country.
Paul Hutton, give us a time frame again. We're talking about 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty, 1876. What was going on in those years?
Well, the Civil War was over. The country was looking for areas to expand to. The country was looking for a place for all those unemployed soldiers to go. 1.5 million Union men who had been in arms, who are now loose, free, looking for opportunity, and the West was that opportunity. The problem was the West was owned by other people. Forts were built to protect routes into the West. Railroads, of course, started pushing westward. Cattle began to expand onto the plains up from Texas. All these forces came together to push the Indians further and further back. A war was fought in 1866 and 1867 over the Bozeman Trail in Wyoming up to the Montana gold fields. The Sioux won that war, and they forced the Army to give up its forts. And by the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, the Sioux got the Army to abandon the post, but they also agreed to a reservation, which was essentially Dakota west of the Missouri River, and included the Black Hills, which were sacred to the Sioux, as they were to many Indian people. The area where we are right now was the Crow Reservation, but it was also unceded hunting territory for all the tribes, and the Sioux retained the right to hunt here because the Army didn't have the power to keep them out. Well, forces built to expand railroads into this area and bring white settlers in, and then in 1874, in an expedition into the Black Hills, where there had long been rumors of gold, Lieutenant Colonel Custer of the 7th Cavalry and his troops found gold. Those reports were spread throughout the East. There had been a panic in '73, an economic depression. People flooded in. At first, the Army tried to keep them out, including Custer's men, but they couldn't. There was no way to stop them, and so the government moved to buy the Black Hills. The Sioux refused to sell. The Army felt that it were the Indians under Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, their spiritual leader up here in this unceded hunting territory that had caused the failure of the negotiations for the sale, they ordered these people back to the reservations, back to the agencies in Dakota so they could keep an eye on them. They refused to go. That set up the Great Sioux War of 1876 and set up this battle here at Little Bighorn.
Who was president then?
U.S. Grant.
How big a country was it back then?
At that time, we would have had about 30 million people in the country.
Don Fixico, how many Native Americans were there?
Approximately at this time?
And back in 1868, 76, those years?
Oh, we can speculate that there probably were about 300,000, but you know, it's so difficult to account because with the movement of native people and certainly with the disease and also the battles that took place, it was very hard to keep track of census of any type of Native American populations.
By the way, how many Native Americans are there in the United States today?
Approximately 2.3 million. And I think that what a lot of people don't realize is that about 2/3 of that population lives in urban areas, not on reservations.
How many do live on reservations?
Well, I guess you can kind of subtract from that, and perhaps maybe 200,000 or something like that, or perhaps just a little bit more. So it's very difficult to ascertain because there's such a movement of Indian people from the reservation to urban areas and back and forth, and most people don't realize that actually Indian people are very mobile people.
By the way, we want to get our viewers involved in this. The phone lines are open. The numbers will be on the screen. You all know by now our area code is 202, and for those of you who live in the Eastern and Central time zones, it's 624-1111. If you live in the Western Mountain time zones, it's 624-1115, and we'll get you on the air in this discussion right away. Professor Fixico, what's behind you up on the hill there?
Behind me is the point of the last stand of George Armstrong Custer, and this is really kind of the epitome of Indian-white relations that in the West there was such a clash. And I believe that it's much more than just kind of the battle of two people, because it was also a conflict of their different beliefs. And on that day, I think that when these two military strengths came into conflict, that this part of the country had a lot to do with it too. This was the homeland of the native people.
Charlotte Black Elk is the granddaughter, I guess, great-granddaughter? Check my list, of Black Elk. Do you know her, Don Fixico?
Oh, I'm sorry I don't, but I'm looking forward to meeting her.
We want to run a little video of her. It was recorded down at Wounded Knee, and I asked Paul Hutton, where does Wounded Knee fit in this? It's a name we hear all the time.
Well, Wounded Knee is generally seen as the last tragic act of the Indian Wars, and it was indeed the same 7th Cavalry that fought here who engaged in a massacre of Indian people there over in Dakota.
She's a great-granddaughter.
Great-granddaughter.
I forgot the great. Here's a clip of Charlotte Black Elk, who is the great-granddaughter of Black Elk, talking about the way she feels about things today, and we will then learn a little bit more about him and the book Black Elk Speaks.
He had the same viewpoint that I think many of us share to this day. We have a real difficult time dealing with quote-unquote white people because of this whole different philosophy. The notion that you would manipulate the earth and how that manifested itself in governmental policy. You know, when you go back to Columbus going back to Spain and the Pope issuing the proclamation that the Inter Terra Papal Bull of 1493 saying you must conquer these people, tear them from their resources and bring them to Jesus. And if you don't, then kill them, was the basic attitude. That has institutionalized into American law and American philosophy toward American Indians. So you may have some good lip service, but in fact the whole policy has been genocide, initially by warfare and then through the smallpox blankets, you know, and then now genocide by bureaucracy. And so you have Black Elk living in an environment that he rebelled against that. And that's the same attitude we have dealing with an institutionalized white people, I guess, with the recognition that all people are humans, all people are relatives, that you can take people as individuals out of that environment and deal with them.
Don Fixico, is there anything there you want to agree or disagree with?
Oh, I very much agree with what she said, and I think that there's such a conflict of differences, and these are actually cultural differences, and we need to look deeper inside of these differences, because it's really the great differences of this country that makes America as it is, because it's a great country of diversity and different ethnic groups and different points of view and gender differences as well. And this is not wrong. This is not a bad thing, but we need to look to our differences, because it's very much a strength of America, and there's so much that the Indian people have to offer in terms of their philosophy and values and beliefs.
Paul Hutton, what was the value of Black Elk Speaks? When did it first come on the scene?
Came out in the 1930s. Black Elk's narrative was reworked and placed in book form by the great Nebraska writer John G. Neihart. At first it was successful, but in a very limited way. Its spiritual power, of course, was the focus of both Black Elk and Neihart, and a lot of early reviewers picked up on that. In the sort of Indian renewal and the Indian political movement of the 1960s, it was rediscovered. In fact, thanks to television. Dick Cavett did a long TV interview with John G. Neihart, who was then, I think, in his 90 or 91st year.
What year did he do that?
I think it was 1971. And the book became an immediate hit again, a huge bestseller, and now is sort of standard reading in classrooms. I often use it in my Western history classes. It's a standard book in all Native Studies, Indian Studies classes around the country. A hugely popular book on college campuses. I bet every college kid in America probably at least holds it in his or her hand sometimes.
And Black Elk is buried at Wounded Knee?
I don't know where Black Elk is.
I think we've got some video show that later. Let's get some phone calls in here from our audience. Our first call up is from Atlanta, Georgia. You're on with Don Fixico and Paul Hutton. Go ahead, please.
My name is Cliff Sullivan. I live in the suburb of Atlanta, and I'm an amateur archaeologist based mostly in Native American cultures. And I just had a comment. He was talking about the number of Native Americans that live in the United States, or today. I, at one time, worked in Mexico a lot, and about 67% of the Mexicans are Native Americans, and now they're flooding across, particularly the South, and they do the laboring jobs, and there's large numbers here. We call them Hispanics, and I think that's an injustice. We ought to call them Native Americans. They look just like...
All right, thanks. Paul Hutton, what do you think?
Well, indeed, much of the population of Mexico is Native American, has Indian blood, and indeed the very definition of what a Mexican would be a mixture of Spanish and Indian blood. So indeed there's a large number of Indians throughout the Americas.
Minneapolis, Minnesota, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. I just wanted to thank Mr. Lamb and his guests for talking about this very important subject, and I want to encourage C-SPAN to show more of this kind of programming, because as a teacher it's important for everybody to remember that this is what our nation was essentially founded on, and people really need to understand that this is our history. And I just thought that Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and Black Elk Speaks are two great resources, and I wondered if our guests had any other books or resources that just all Americans should read to understand our history.
Don Fixico, do you have a suggestion?
Yes, I'd like to comment on that, because with the revival of Black Elk Speaks, it was a very pivotal time period in the late 1960s, because other powerful books came out at that time. Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, but also Von Delory Jr.'s Custer Died for Your Sins, and N. Scott Momaday's book, Housemaid of Dawn. These books were so essential to the 1960s in regard to the rise of American Indian Studies programs. There are like 112 in the United States and Canada today. And as a result of that, much of the scholarship and studying of American Indians occurred from that time period, and so it really kind of established a momentum. And we see a lot of Native people and non-Indians as well studying American Indian history, American culture, due to that time period, and of course Black Elk Speaks.
Want to remind our audience that the phone lines are open now. We do have some open lines. You can call us at 202-624-1111 and 202-624-1115. Paul Hutton, if you walk through the cemetery, you see things like this. Most of what you see on these stones here are American soldiers. But here you see White Swan, U.S. Scout with Reno. What's that mean?
White Swan was one of the Crow Scouts with Reno. It's not widely known, of course, that Crows and Arikaras fought with Custer's men against the Sioux, who were their traditional enemies. In fact, they saw the Sioux as the invader into their land. This was Crow land, and the Crow had been fighting the Sioux for 100 years. The Sioux had only come onto the northern plains 100 years before, and our whole idea of the Plains Indian, befeathered, on horseback, hunting the buffalo, that was a cultural development that lasted for only a century. And it was the heyday of the Great Plains culture, but the Sioux had come out of the east, out of Minnesota, onto the plains, forced out, in fact, by white pressure, by Chippewa and other Indians who were their enemies to the east. They had invaded the lands of the Mandan, the Hidatsa, the Crow, the Shoshone, and they had overtaken this country and had made it theirs.
Next call, Endicott, New York. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello, my name is Belinda Spence, and I'm living in Endicott, New York right now. And I would just like to say that I didn't find out about my Native American heritage until I was in my 30s. I had one foreign grandparent, and all the rest were Native Americans. And I'd like to urge people to pass this on to their children if they at all possibly can in any way. It's very important to an awful lot of people that they understand what their heritage is in terms of how they deal with life.
Don Fixico, what is your background?
Actually, my background is 4 different Indian nations, Shawnee, Sac and Fox, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole.
I don't know how to ask this question, but how do all the different Indian groups today get along? Are there still fights among them? We're talking about the difference between the Crow and the Sioux who didn't get along here.
Yes, I think we have to look back at the history because there are cultural differences between Indian people as well. And we're talking about people who always perhaps disagreed because of political differences, because of cultural differences as well. And that still continues. Indian people are not just one people. The term Indian is just very generic. It doesn't describe all Indian people. It's so categorical. But all Indian people, because of different nations and different cultures, are very, very different. And I think that we've kind of stereotyped Indian people to be all the same, and we are not.
Brookline, Massachusetts. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes. I wonder if someone can answer the question, which administration conducted a policy of extermination toward American Indians, toward all of the tribes? Was there any particular administration that stated that policy?
Paul Hutton?
Well, no administration in the 19th century has clean hands in dealing with American Indians, and it begins with George Washington, and it gets progressively worse. The Jackson administration was particularly bad. The Grant administration, which actually pioneered what was called the peace policy, was one of the worst in terms of making warfare on the Indians. At no time in American history was there a policy that I would categorize as genocide. At no time was there ever an official American policy of extermination against Native peoples. However, that doesn't mean that generals like Phil Sheridan aren't famous for saying the only good Indian is a dead Indian.
Will Saw, Montana. Our next call. Go ahead, please.
Hi. Yeah, I was just there at the battlefield this last Sunday, and I've gone through there a bunch of times, and I've never stopped, and I finally did, and I was really glad I did. I highly recommend it to everybody. The way that it's laid out with the headstones where they found the soldiers, you really get that sense of actually being able to see what happened, the terror of the battle, and the arrogance of the military when they were going to go into this village, and the Indians got on those guys like a swarm of bees. It was fascinating. Highly recommend it.
Don Fixico, what does this spot mean to you?
It means that, this very place, being the homeland of the Lakota people, as well as the Crow people, it was a place that had to be defended because this was the source of their beliefs, source of their strength. It was them. And when the people are put into a situation like that, they indeed are going to fight with everything. Their beliefs, the women and children, all of these resources are going to be pulled together to fight for the homeland.
Before we move, Paul Hutton, I want John Kelly here as a camera, and I want folks to get some sense of where we are. And John, if you can come over here just closer to me, and I want to show up there on the hillside and just explain this as he does a 360 degree. As you look over there toward the teepees and you look up on top of the hill, what is that?
Well, that is what's known as Last Stand Hill, and that is where Custer and about 45 of his men, what was left of his 5 companies, 212 men, made the so-called famous Last Stand, the image that's so storied in Hollywood and in paintings.
Okay, as he goes off to the right, we're looking down what?
We're looking down what's known as Custer Ridge, and Custer attempted to hold that whole ridge line, and another detachment of his troops were killed at the very end of the ridge line.
Now over there, what mountains in the distance?
Far off, we have the Wolf Mountains, and that's actually where Custer came from, marching here to the Little Bighorn Valley to attempt to find.
As he sweeps around here, which distance? Where are we looking off?
We're looking off now to Wyoming, and the mountains, the Purple Mountains off in the distance are the Bighorns. And indeed, after the battle, that's where the Indians retreated to as troops came after them.
And as we come around here, what direction are we looking right there?
And we're looking to the west there.
To the west?
To the west, and sort of to the west and the north, off toward Billings.
We have another call. This time our call comes from, let me see here, it's Ardmore, Oklahoma. Go ahead, Ardmore, you're on the air.
Hi, how are you this morning? Appreciate your program.
Good.
I tell you, living in Oklahoma all my life, I've grown up around Native Americans, and I kind of have a different insight on Custer. And I'm not too sure the American people should memorialize him as the way they do, and I'd like to get your guest comments on that. Thank you.
Don Fixico, do the American people memorialize General Custer or Lieutenant Colonel Custer, whatever you want to call him at whatever time?
There are all different types of interpretations about George Armstrong Custer, because it was such a situation of a lose-lose case, and he was not going to win this battle. Why did he do it? There's something about maybe in American beliefs about trying to go against all odds and coming out victorious. Whether that be the case or whether he was a fool for doing what he tried to do, who can really tell? We can only kind of guess, and I think it's because of this type of mystery that surrounds George Armstrong Custer that it keeps people fascinated. And this battle itself, it is so pivotal in American history that when you think about other battles like the Battle of Gettysburg, which 172,000 men fought in that battle, far fewer soldiers and warriors fought in this particular battle at Little Bighorn, but the one that is romanticized, the one that has captured the imagination of America is this one.
Paul Hutton, he was a general when he was 23. Why did he end up being a lieutenant colonel?
Well, after the Civil War, he was a major general in the U.S. Volunteers. U.S. Volunteers ceased to exist at the end of the Civil War, and he was actually promoted from captain to lieutenant colonel in the regular army. He was also a brevet major general in the regular army. If I could add, he was a magnificent soldier, a magnificent cavalry leader in the Civil War, did more than almost anyone of his generation to end slavery and save the Union. He wasn't out here freelancing at the Little Bighorn. He had been ordered here by his government. He was doing their bidding. He was a brave soldier who died for his country. He could use a memorial, although this is not one to him. This is a memorial to the battle.
We're going to read a passage from Black Elk Speaks in a moment, but first let's take a call from Fraser Park, California. Good morning.
Good morning. My question is for Don. Don, I've cowboyed all over the country. I'm just down the street from you in Wilo there, and over the hill on Little Bighorn Creek for the Crone Ranch, all the way over to Oahe and in Reservation, Nevada. And my concern is how the Indians are getting along with the American government now. With their housing's not good, their reservations don't look real good. Did you guys get a lot of subsidies from the government, or are they helping you out any of these days?
Don Fixico?
Well, we're right now under a current policy of American Indian self-determination, which has been in effect since 1975. And this is a situation of allowing tribal governments to really kind of introduce housing with the aid of federal subsistence to help their own people. But when you look at all these different cases, there are actually 562 federally recognized tribes. And if you want to seek success in a very visible sense, that means that at least 500 have to be successful. That's not the situation. And I think what we're really kind of seeing is kind of the more difficult situations where that tribal governments and Indian nations have not been successful, and too often we kind of focus on those that are not successful. But I think when you look across the board at the standard of Indian life, it's much higher, it's much better. More Indian people are going to college, working in better occupations, things of that sort. And so it's just those that are not doing well, sometimes they capture too much attention.
Pulaski, Tennessee, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. My question follows very closely on the heels of that one. I'm interested in life on the reservation as it presently is. I noted Mr. FIXIO saying that that the Indians are very mobile people and have moved from reservations into urban areas and then back again. Are young people staying on the reservation? Is life at subsidy level on the reservation? And one other little sidelight, we were in Canada a few years back, and I found more of a wards of the state sort of mentality, it appeared, from the people we talked with in Canada concerning their Indian population, which appears to be more isolated and less assimilated into the general society than ours. I would appreciate Mr. FIXIO's comments. Thank you. Thank you for this program.
Professor FIXIO, go ahead, please.
The idea of wards of the state is really an old idea and an old concept. And really it tells us about the paternalism of the United States government, of the Canadian government as well. And in many ways it has really kind of crushed any type of optimism and any type of efforts by tribal governments themselves. What we see, I think, in this new century is that there's more of a confidence in tribal governments, more effective leaderships, and as a result of that, I think we're going to see some startling changes. There has been a return to Indian reservations because the tribes themselves are actually able to mobilize their resources and introduce more programs, and they're more effective in doing that, whereas maybe a generation ago they were less effective, maybe with more federal regulations. But I think that we're going to see the dawn of a new age in which return of tribal governments are going to be much, much stronger.
Paul Hutton, back to Black Elk. He was about 13 years old during the battle here. Was he here?
He was right here. He was down in the river swimming when the soldiers came. The Indians were taken completely by surprise, which just seems amazing because they just had a big fight with General Crook the week before. And he rushed back and had to get the ponies together for his family. That was his job as a young boy, and his mother had given him a pistol. And he got that pistol and rushed off to give it to his brother, who was racing to the Hunkpapa Circle, which is down at the other end of the valley where Major Reno attacked, and rushed down there and got caught up in the battle. One of the youngest of those who fought. He was really too young to be fighting in the battle.
If you've never read much about the American Indian and you pick up that book alone, after you've read it, what do you learn?
I think you learn a lot about Native life in that time of incredible transition. It was an unbelievable time of transition in the late 19th century. But you also find, and of course this is the hallmark of the book, the deep spirituality of Black Elk and of Native peoples, and gives you an insight into their cosmos, into their world, which a lot of Americans just don't have any clue about.
So if he was 13 in 1876 when he was here, he died 1950? Did he last that long?
Maybe 40s, I think. I'm not quite sure. Don might remember his...
Don FIXIO, do you know what...
Yeah, I think Paul is closer to the 1940s.
And he's buried at Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is about 400 miles from here.
Right.
Down in South Dakota. What relationship does the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation have to the Black Hills and to what went on here?
Well, that's where the Sioux, many of the Sioux were placed. That's where their agency was after the invasion of the Black Hills, the
What's
Great
an
Sioux
agency?
War. That's where they drew their rations and were kept as wards of the state, especially in the late 19th century. That's where their land was.
I have a passage here, one that several we want to read during the 2.5-hour program, and this is from Black Elk Speaks, and I'll read it. It was the next summer when I was 11 years old, that would have been 1874, that the first sign of new trouble came to us. After I learned that it was Powhasset, is that the way I pronounce it?
Mm-hmm.
Powhasset Custer, who had led his soldiers into the Black Hills that summer to see what he could find. He had no right to go in there because all that country was ours. want to add something to that, Mr. Fixico?
Well, I think that what is said there is that this was letting the federal government, letting the United States military know that this was indeed our homeland, that it was a clear message that we were going to fight for it, meaning the native point of view at that time, and this was it. It was not just the so-called Custer's last stand, but in many ways it was the native peoples, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, it was their last stand as well. And they were going to call on all resources, and we're not just talking about just warrior populations, but all the metaphysical forces as well, to make things work that day in a very favorable way towards Indian people.
Des Moines, Iowa. You're on the air. Go ahead, please, with your comment or question.
Hi, Brian. Hey, great show this morning. I've been to the Custer battlefield several times, and you always learn something new when you go there, and I would recommend it to everyone. You have a train going by there?
We do, yes. A rather large train.
Was Custer looking for gold in that trip from that passage that you, or the expedition that you just read from?
Well, what I just read from was Black Elk Speaks, and it was in 1874, and we were talking about the Black Hills. Paul Hutton, you want to pick up on that?
It was a military expedition which was actually allowed by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. They were allowed to go in and establish a fort at the western end of the Black Hills. Custer took miners with him. There had been rumors of gold in the Black Hills for many, many years. Custer was a great western booster. In fact, that railroad is symbolic. Custer was a big promoter of the railroads and wanted to help develop the West. And so he went to the Black Hills looking for gold, and he found it. There's lots of gold in the Black Hills still today.
Next call, we go to Fort Wayne, Indiana. Go ahead, Fort Wayne, you're on the air.
Thank you. Dr. Hutton, I saw you a few days ago on a brilliant presentation on Boone and Crockett, and you talked about the Alamo. Don't you think that the Alamo and the Bighorn accelerated white conquest?
Well, it is sort of interesting. I mean, Davy Crockett's death at the Alamo, the death of Custer here at the Little Bighorn were then used by the government as excuses for expansion. And after all the years of struggle between the government and the Sioux over the northern plains, it was over, essentially, within 2 years after Custer's last stand. Custer's death was indeed the last stand for the Sioux in terms of holding on to their traditional way of life.
A couple of years ago, this place was called the Custer National Battlefield or Monument, and the name's been changed to Little Bighorn. Why did that happen?
Well, in 1991, Congress changed the name of the battlefield from Custer Battlefield National Monument to Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, and they also at that time authorized the construction of an Indian memorial here at Little Bighorn, which many of us are still working toward. They did it because it was up until that time seen as a monument to Custer, and the idea was to change it to a more neutral status where it would be a memorial to all Americans, both Native Americans and Euro-Americans or white Americans who fought here. And indeed, it's been one of the flashpoints in the contentious debate over our Western history and our national story. The story of the West is very much our story as Americans, all of us as Americans. And places like Little Bighorn, like the Alamo, are flashpoints in that cultural battle over who's going to control that story.
If you want to find this place on the map, go to Montana and look for I-90 in Billings. We're 60 miles from Billings on I-90. That train we hear in the background is parallel to I-90, and we're at exit 520. As we take another call, Logansport, Indiana. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, good morning, Brian. Thank you
Morning.
for your program on the Black Elk and General Custer. My mother's maiden name was Custer, and we've traced that back. General Custer evidently did not have children. He and his wife have one of the most beautiful love stories of our beloved country, but they had no children, and she followed him all over, enduring the hardships that he did because of their great love. But my mother traced her ancestry to his brother Richard. And we had an opportunity several years ago to come down from North Dakota and visit Fort Lincoln, from which they started out on this treacherous journey. And the Mandan Indian tribe was there, and we saw some houses, the Hogans there, and came down and saw Mount Rushmore and Custer State Park. And thank you for sharing this bit of history with our country. God bless you.
Thanks for your call. And I want to ask Don Fixico, for 57 years after Custer's death, here his wife went around the country, gave speeches, wrote articles, eventually moved to New York City. The story she was telling about what happened, was it accurate?
Well, it certainly seems to be, because it shows us something about the resilience of his wife, that you know, she continued life beyond him. And too often we think that in America, that America is really kind of a great man's history. And certainly that Mrs. Custer, you know, had a very fruitful life after that, wrote several books, became somewhat famous herself. And it kind of, if there is indeed a women's movement, she was actually kind of part of that, and gave us kind of a different point of view. And I think that helps us to kind of see the fuller picture of America.
Well, Hutton, we've seen the sun now for the first time in a couple of days.
It's come through, finally.
Very
Here it is.
bright out here. What's it like normally on a day like this?
Hot, just exceedingly hot here on the northern plains, and we've actually had sort of cool weather. It's been muggy, which is unusual. On the day of the battle, June 25th, 1876, it was a very hot day. In every possible way, of course.
I read this morning there were some 6,000 people here a couple of weeks ago when you had the reenactment.
I was here that day. It was a great day, June 25th, 125th anniversary of the battle. There was a reenactment down in Hardin, and thousands of people here. We did some book signings, and we did a roll call of the dead. All of the tribal groups came in and did memorials for their people and that fought here. AIM came in, did a demonstration in favor of the Indian Memorial. AIM and the U.S. government are now on the same side. I thought that was pretty interesting. And it was just a fabulous day, and people were coming together, and that's what this place ought to be about, reconciliation.
And they're going to build a monument right up on top of the hill?
Build that monument right over there on the ridge, just down from the mass grave of the soldiers, will be the new Indian Memorial, which hopefully will go up in the next 2 years, trying to get funding through Congress.
I read in the local paper that the Appropriations Subcommittee has passed it through at $2.3 million. That's
right.
As we take a call from Glendive, Montana. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Good morning. My name is Terry Bronson. I'm born and raised here, but my heritage was hid from me, and I'm 63 years old, and somewhere in my mid-40s I had this, well, I guess you call them visions or voices speaking to me in my head about my heritage, and I've been searching since, and I'm sitting here looking at about 30-some books. And I would like the gentleman to, if he could, give me the names of those couple other books that he mentioned earlier in the program. And I would like to know what he thinks of George Catlin's letters and notes in North America, Catlin's Indians, and James Mooney's The Ghost Dance, Gloria Hood.
Thanks, caller. Don Fixico, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I think if I can remember all the questions and requests here.
Paul Hutton can help you.
Custer Died for Your Sins by Vine Delory Jr. Was one of the books I mentioned. N. Scott Momaday's Pulitzer-winning prize, Housemaid of Dawn, was the other book that I mentioned. And the other part of the request, I can't quite remember what.
The other book Don mentioned was the fabulous book by D. Brown, the great bestseller that really changed American attitudes toward Indians. I think it's the most important book on Indians written in the 20th century. D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. A good book on Catlin for the listener is Brian W. Dippy, Catlin and his contemporaries. And indeed, Catlin did wonderful work with the Indians.
The American Writers Series is focusing this particular program on Black Elk Speaks, and you said that he spoke it, he didn't write it.
He spoke it to John Neihardt, the wonderful Nebraska poet, and Neihardt took it and had an enormous influence on the narrative itself.
Where'd they do it?
They did it over at Pine Ridge. They did it on the reservation, and Black Elk would talk to Neihardt, opened up to Neihardt. He had a vision that Neihardt was going to come, and he told Neihardt that story. And not only, of course, the story of those days, the last days of the buffalo hunting plains tribes, but also of the spiritual depth of the Lakota people.
Chula Vista, California. You're our next caller. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. My question is for Don. My great-grandmother was married to, she was Apache, and my great-grandfather was Lakota Sioux. And it was passed down to us about a prophecy regarding custard. And I'm very unclear about that. If he could address that question, I thought they said something to the effect that he was prophesied by the people as coming, the blonde hair, the man on a horse, and so on. Is that valid, or can you answer the question? Thank you.
I'll try to respond to that, and if I can't answer it, I'll just make up an answer. How's that? It's a difficulty in trying to understand prophecy, because prophecy, how accurate is it, and whether things come into be when they're prophesized or not. But I think that Native American prophets and medicinal people, shamans, holy people, things like that, they had a special kind of sense, a kind of a gift. And many times that they saw things like that and they could forecast. Sitting Bull was one of these individuals who had that type of gift. And so they very often knew what was going to happen before then. Perhaps they already saw the defeat of Custer. Perhaps they already saw him coming. Such an individual, so striking that I think that there are some things out there that, in a metaphysical sense, that they have so much of a bearing or influence on our lives that we tend to discount them because we don't really understand them. It's not scientific, so therefore it's not a part of our reality. But indeed, it's very much a part of the American Indian reality.
Where we're standing, Paul Hutton, is right in the middle of both the cemetery, and over here is 3 or 4 teepees, and up there the visitor center, and out there, of course, the battlefield. Question to you is, how many people come here on a daily basis? Of course, I asked Neil Mangum, that the superintendent, but are there enough people that come to hear this story?
Oh, very much. I think they get about 300,000 visitors a year. Neil can correct me on that. It's, of course, a very popular site. It's right on the road to Yellowstone, so folks often come here. I remember as a kid, I just couldn't wait to get here. I had to wait, though. It was 1968 before I made my first visit here. It's one of the most beautiful and haunting places in all of the United States, and certainly in the American West. I think it's a trip everybody ought to take out here.
Don Fixco, anybody still live in teepees?
Well, I think that we do more on kind of a ceremonial occasions, and possibly even in rural areas, yes. When you're so close to your traditions that sometimes it's a way of kind of reconnecting, and trying to get away from that it's very difficult, because if it's a part of you, you're always going to do that.
Let's go to Albuquerque, New Mexico for our next call. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. My compliments for an excellent and necessary discussion. My question this morning is really for Paul, and it's regarding kind of his perspective on the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. As both he and Neil know, there are literally thousands of Native American human remains still stored in museums across this country, most of which do receive federal funding. There's questions of remains being, quote-unquote, culturally unidentified, and disputes arising over how they will be handled. A lot of those remains represent battlefields just like this, and so that's kind of where my question is, what Paul's thoughts are on how that act can be implemented.
Well, that's a highly controversial question and a highly controversial act. A lot of archaeologists and anthropologists want to retain those bones for further study. A lot of grave robbing went on in the late 19th and early 20th century, and anthropologists were doing much of it. I think people ought to get their families' bones back and be able to do with them as they wish.
Atlanta, Georgia. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Hi, my question is for Don. I have actually 2 questions I'd like him to answer. The first one is regarding your television program last week at Mount Rushmore. The superintendent, Dan Wank, when he was questioned by a caller as to why he didn't speak about the surrounding Native people at all during the show, his reply was that it was irrelevant. And I thought that was rather appalling, considering that you have the faces of 4 white presidents carved into illegally stolen land from the Lakota and the Dakota and the Nakota nations. So I'd like him to respond to that. The second question I'd really like him to respond to is, why is Native America still, after all these centuries, so invisible to mainstream America? Thank you.
Thanks. Don Fixico, we did a show down at Mount Rushmore, and Dan Wink, who's the superintendent there, spent 2 hours with us. But we also talked about Crazy Horse, and we do have video showing the Crazy Horse Monument, which is just 17 miles away from Mount Rushmore. I don't want to argue with the lady who called, but I suspect that my memory is that Dan Wink did not say that the Native American was irrelevant. He may have said it was irrelevant to that particular moment, but give us your view on Mount Rushmore and the Crazy Horse Monument and the Black Hills and a little bit of what the caller was all about.
Well, I think it's quite fitting that there be some type of memorial to Crazy Horse, because Crazy Horse played such an integral part of Lakota history and Lakota culture and for this part of the country. Mount Rushmore, as it is in the Black Hills, it is kind of in the heart of Indian country as well. But I think with the two kind of being there, that it tells us that there is something much greater than the prejudice, discrimination, the separateness, that this is a nation of really kind of unity, where that Indians and whites have warred against each other. The United States military, the United States government has perhaps kind of suppressed Indian nations, that overall we are still in one place. And that maybe it is a time, Donnie, of new thinking, new ideas, more sensitivity and awareness, that there is another point of view, there is another side. There are Indian people. Why are we so invisible? Because we are so few, and it's in the process of assimilation, moving to urban areas. 2/3 of the Indian population lives in cities and not on reservations, means that Indians are integrating themselves into urban areas. And if that's the situation, then I think that you're going to see Indians kind of a part of the American mainstream, and not necessarily in the stereotyped way, which means we're going to have to correct our vision about Indian people. And we should not just kind of stereotype Indians and keep them in the past, living in teepees, living on reservations, because Indian people are very, very adaptable. There's one thing I think to be alert about Indian people, is that they've learned to survive, and their adaptability is proven, has been proven over the centuries. We're still here.
We have some phone lines open for those of you who want to join us on this discussion from the Little Bighorn battlefield. Where did they get the name Bighorn?
It's from the river. The Bighorn River is a tributary of the Yellowstone. The Little Bighorn is the smaller version of the Bighorn that flows just right down there in the valley. That was the river the Indians had camped on. This place was called the Greasy Grass, one of their favorite buffalo hunting spots.
In the Black Elk Speaks, you hear Black Elk talking about great visions. You also hear him talk about the spirit of the Black Hills. Don Fixico, what does he mean? What's the spirit of the Black Hills?
Well, if I could just perhaps read a passage, and it's not a very long one, but I think that it describes, the philosophy of himself, his people, and it reads that, "Then I was standing on the highest mountain of them all, and round about beneath me was the whole hoop of the world. And while I stood there, I saw more than I can tell, and I understood more than I saw, for I was seen in a sacred manner, the shapes of all things in the spirit, and the shape of all shapes as they must live together like one being. I saw the sacred hoop of my people was one of many hoops that made one circle, wide as daylight and as starlight, and in the center grew one mighty flowering tree to shelter all the children of one mother and one father, and I saw that it was holy." Black Elk is really talking about not just Indian people, he's talking about all people. He's talking about the enemy, he's talking about Custer, if Custer had survived all this, that in a way that the hoop is the circular belief, and that we are all related in a particular way, whether we like it or not. And so that in some way we must learn to live together, and I think this is what his prophecy is about.
Albuquerque, New Mexico, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, my name is Joseph. I'm an African American, and I grew up in New Mexico. We have a good relationship with the Native American community. My question, particularly, is to Mr. Sutton. We tend, and I see you doing the same thing right now. We tend to idolize great soldiers for their great military works, but in all trueness, they should be viewed for what they stood for. Custer is just like Robert E. Lee, a great soldier, but he's stupid because he fought for the wrong reason. He fought for a reason that destroyed humanity. Mr. Sutton, you're idolizing him just like Custer is idolized. And if you're going to take that, let's look at Hitler. Hitler was excellent at what he did, but he needs to be viewed in history, just like Custer and just like Robert E. Lee. These people are totally wrong for what they stand for. My question is, how do you feel about a person being a military genius, but he was stupid about what he fought for? And I think you're
Thanks, caller. Paul Hutton.
Well, I've rarely heard Custer compared to both Robert E. Lee and Adolf Hitler in the same sentence. He fought at the bidding of the United States government. He was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. He drew that pay, and he did the bidding of the government. He wasn't out here freelancing. He was a good soldier. He didn't do a good job this day. What happened here, though I think because of the spiritual power of the Indians that day, was beyond any of his powers as a soldier, but he did a bad job. I don't idolize him, and I don't think we need to build him up to be more than he was, but certainly we don't need to blame him for all of the evils of the 19th century Indian Wars and government Indian policy. He was simply doing the bidding of the Grant administration and the United States government.
Our director today is Tom Aldridge. Site manager is Eric Hansen, and our producer is the very hard to work with Mark Farkas, as we've all learned in the last couple of days. He's been very tough on all of us. We have a call from Leventon, Michigan. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
I wanted to ask about the final defeat of the Lakota Sioux by the decimation of the buffalo.
Don Fixico?
Well, I think she's referring to the Battle of Wounded Knee, or the massacre at Wounded Knee, because that was really kind of the last chapter, the last major incident in which it brought a close to the Indian Wars.
What year was that?
In 1890. But what it also did was to really kind of remind America, the public, that so much decimation had been done to the Native American population, that the Indian population had really kind of sunk to the lowest ebb of like 250,000, perhaps even 225,000. We're talking about the point of extinction. But in addition to that, the buffalo population had been reduced severely as well, to the point of maybe 1,200 or maybe even less than 1,000. It was so difficult to even find buffalo during that time, and it really was kind of a closing chapter with the Wounded Knee Massacre, with the decimation of the buffalo, the demobilization of Plains Indian people placed on reservations. It was a really kind of a drastic change in Indian life, marking perhaps something new. Indians were learning to live on reservations, but being placed on reservations, really kind of POW camps. There were something like 1,642 military campaigns that were waged against Indians, battles and skirmishes, things of all sorts from small scale to large scale, and this was really kind of the close of it.
Livermore, California, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Question for Don Hutton. Recently, a couple of minutes ago, he made a comment about the reenactment in town at Hardin. I wonder why he didn't make a comment about the reenactment that was actually done on the Indian campsite down there at Mr. Richard Reelberg. I happened to reenact in that particular reenactment, and it was awesome to be able to be on that property. It seems to me, when I was there, that the people of Hardin and the people of the Crow Indian Reservation still do not get along very well. The people in Hardin were saying that the reenactment at Reelbird was canceled. There was not a lot of publicity about that. I would appreciate hearing your comments.
What's he talking about?
There is a reenactment down at Medicine Tail Coulee, which is actually the divide down which Custer went to send at least one of his troops to attack the Indian village. And as I understand it, the reenactment that goes down at Mr. Reelbird's ranch is really, really good. And a lot of reenactors, a lot of people speak very highly of it. I simply didn't mention it. No conspiracy, just I had forgotten that it had gone on. And indeed, I've heard lots of good things about it. I think there's some hostility, though, out here between the Hardin folks doing their reenactment and Mr. Reelbird doing his reenactment.
Hardin is how far from here?
Hardin's about 15 miles from here.
If you've just joined us, we're at the, it used to be called Custer's Last Stand. I think they call it Custer's Last Battle now. But
yeah.
2 hours difference from the East Coast. So if you're watching it live, we started at 7 a.m. and this area opens to the public at 8 a.m. So you're now beginning to see people walk through the cemetery. And you'll see them over here at demonstrations later around the teepee. And we're going to meet the superintendent of this national park, national monument, I guess it's called, in just a few minutes. White River Junction, Vermont. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, gentlemen. My name is Jay, calling from White River Junction, Vermont. Just kind of wanted to bring to all of our attention this morning of a leader, a great leader that we have lost here in Vermont. A gentleman up in Swanton, Vermont, from the Abenaki Pennacook tribe has passed away. A great leader that we've had for years and years and years. So I want to maybe bring that to our attention. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for calling. San Antonio, Texas. You're on the air. Please go ahead. Hello, San Antonio.
Yes. Hello?
Please go ahead. You're on the air.
I wondered how many people actually know how Custer, his events here at Little Bighorn, was actually overshadowed his Civil War career. And upon the time that I visited the battlefield there, the soldiers that had been reinterred from the military posts throughout the West, as I entered the battlefield, it was an eerie feeling. I could not stay. I had to leave because I felt the presence. And at the present, I visited Civil War battlefields, the Revolutionary War, and everything, but that is the only one in America that affected me. You know, there is a presence still there alive.
Thanks, caller. Colonel Custer is not buried here. Why not?
He is buried at West Point. His body, or at least what they thought was his body, was disinterred a year later and taken back and buried amidst much pomp and ceremony at West Point. And when his wife died in 1932, she was buried there beside him.
Again, he was how old when he was here?
He was 36 years old. He had written his autobiography when he was 34. Smart move, I guess, if you're only going to live to 36. It also says something about somebody's character that they think they need to write their autobiography when they're 34 years old. Certainly, he was a seeker after glory, a vainglorious man. Many thought he was pompous, arrogant, but he had achieved a lot in a very short time, and he was one of those soldiers that liked to fight. He was one of those people who loved war, no question about it. And he saw war as a way to gain power for himself, in a way that Crazy Horse understood that. That here was, in battle, you could gain influence over others and you could be a leader of your people. And certainly here at Little Bighorn, he was seeking after that power, but it wasn't his day. The caller talked about the spirituality of this place, and I'm one of the least spiritual people on the planet, but this place is haunting. Not haunted, but it's haunting, and you feel the sense of the power that existed that day in this great struggle, which has become so symbolically powerful as the spot that symbolizes all of the struggle between Native Americans and European Americans.
Knoxville, Tennessee. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, sir. I wanted to know what was the role of the Buffalo Soldiers in that particular campaign? Did they have a role in that campaign? Thank you.
Don Fixico, you want to try that?
Actually, I'm going to punt, and I'm going to give that to Paul Hutton.
The Buffalo Soldiers were not involved in this particular campaign, although they were actively involved in the Wounded Knee campaign that led up to the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. And in fact, the Buffalo Soldiers had to rescue the 7th Cavalry at Wounded Knee when they got surrounded by the Sioux briefly.
Next call, Tampa, Florida. Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, my name is Kay Littlefeather, and I was calling asking about the Mr. Custer. Wasn't it true that he ran on a drunken rampage with the soldiers and took the Indians in and massacred them?
Don Fixico?
And massacred which Indians? I guess I'm...
Well, she's obviously not talking about this particular spot here. What about his past and fighting of Indians before he got here?
Indeed, and I think that probably... and I'd like to kind of pick up on what Paul said a little while ago, because Custer was really kind of set out to establish themselves. And we have to, I think, kind of keep in mind, too, that people didn't live a long time. And so if you're going to establish yourself in some type of way and become legendary or something, the way that maybe Custer saw himself, you know, you're going to have to do that maybe in your 20s, late 20s or something like that, or even your early 30s. What he did do was to really kind of to enjoy the West. He enjoyed war. He was, we had so much warfare during that time period that a young man's life was really In going to the West, you could live a much quieter life by perhaps working for the railroad, but a more glorious life with being in the military, and Custer was of that nature. But even more than that, I think he wanted to be valued in some particular way and to be remembered in some particular fashion. And one way of doing that was fighting Indians. Other military leaders had done that. Andrew Jackson had gained such fame being an Indian fighter. And so we have Custer doing the same thing as well. And there were other earlier campaigns that he was participating in, which the Battle of the Washita, for example, he was there, he was instrumental, and out of that he gained fame and add to his glory. And we're talking about a very young man at that time.
If you've just joined us, this is our American Writer Series. It continues going across the country. I think our next stop is, among other places, Springfield, Massachusetts, the University of Massachusetts, where the papers of William E.B. Du Bois are located, and also down in Tuskegee, the Tuskegee School and Institute, where we're going to be focusing on Booker T. Washington. But this particular week, it's Black Elk Speaks, a book that was published in what year?
1931, I believe.
And you say you use it in the classroom. What do you find among your students about their attitudes about the American Indian as you begin your discussion, and then what is it like at the end of the semester?
Well, down in New Mexico, my kids are pretty well educated on Indians because we have a large native population in the state. But when I used to teach up in Utah or back in Indiana, kids just didn't know anything about Indians. And they could find in Black Elk's story not only a good history of the last years of the Plains Indians, but also a good introduction to Indian spirituality and a different worldview. Neihardt thought, in fact, that this would be a new religion that might sweep the world.
Don Fixico, you teach at the University of Kansas, been there 4 years. Before that, where'd you teach?
Actually, I'm just there for 2.5 years and still obviously still there, but before I'd been at Western Michigan University, where we used Black Elk Speaks there, and also at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The one time that I was a visiting professor at San Diego State, I was using Black Elk Speaks in my American Indian History survey class, but 3 other departments were also using Black Elk Speaks. I think a class in literature, one in philosophy, I think one in religion. Black Elk Speaks is a very inclusive document because it covers history, it covers culture, it covers philosophy, it covers the oral tradition of Indian people, and so it was very path-breaking when it was published, but really didn't receive enough attention, I think, until the late 1960s, I think, when the nation was ready for it.
Next call, Huntsville, Alabama. You're on the air. Good morning.
Good morning, Brian, Mr. Hutton. I was born and raised in northern Indiana, and my parents, we lived near a cemetery in Plymouth, Indiana. And in the summer times, I would work in the cemetery and mow grass, and I always looked at the grave markers there, and I found one that said, "The last message bearer of General Custer." I don't recall the name, but I've often wondered about that, and wonder if Mr. Hutton there would have any light on who that might be or any circumstances about him.
Well, I don't know who's buried in Plymouth, Indiana, but the last message bearer for Custer was a young Italian immigrant by the name of Giovanni Martini. And Custer got up on top of that ridge and he looked down at that valley and he saw farmer Indians, and he thought he was going to confront at the Little Bighorn. Indeed, the Indian Bureau had been lying to the Army about how many Indians had left the reservation, and Custer immediately tried to pull together his scattered regiment, and he sent Martini back with a message to Captain Benteen, who had 3 companies of cavalry and the pack train and all the extra ammunition. He knew he needed more ammunition. And Martini had this message that said, Benteen, big village, be quick, bring packs. And then P.S., bring packs. And Martini galloped back. He found Benteen. Martini couldn't speak English. And he couldn't describe to Benteen what he had seen. And all he could say was, Indians day skedaddling, like out of some bad movie. And so Benteen thought Custer had attacked the village and the Indians had scattered. And he was one of those sort of malcontents anyway, and he was unhappy every day, and, oh, Custer's going to get all the glory. And so he didn't hurry up, and he disregarded the order, and Custer and his 5 companies were left to their fate.
Don Fixico, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Oklahoma.
And Oklahoma has one of the higher number of Indians in the state, in the country. Do you feel it when you live there?
Indeed, you do, because there's an Indian presence. Actually, 67 different tribes were removed to Indian territory. And today there's 39 federally recognized tribes with functioning tribal governments. And so Oklahoma, the name of Oklahoma is the land of the red people. It's a Choctaw word. And like this area here, very much you have an Indian presence there.
You and I grew up in Indiana. You're an Indianapolis native. Indiana, Indianapolis, those names come from?
Indians, of course, and it always struck me when I would go down to the Circle in Indianapolis, the big monument to the Civil War, and they had all these statues of great Indiana heroes. George Rogers Clark was there, William Henry Harrison, Morton, the Civil War governor. It struck me there wasn't a statue to Tecumseh. I always thought Tecumseh was the greatest warrior who ever lived in Indiana and deserved a statue. Indiana ought to put one up to him.
Don Fixico, I grew up on Shawnee Avenue. There was a school there called Tecumseh Middle School or junior high. There's a school called Miami. There was a street right near us called Wyandotte. And I've learned over the years that all had some relationship to the Indian world. Can you help us on any of those names and where they come from?
Well, obviously they come from the indigenous peoples of that part of the country, but it also tells us about the importance of, their role, their culture, the names that they gave to certain sites that, like this area being the greasy grass. There's certain reasons for that, because a lot of times they're very practical, but they also tell us something about how the native people saw these different areas. And as a result, then they become the names that we know these sites, rivers, cities by. And it tells us something about the contribution of Indian people to America, that it's not just a country of, whether the conquerors written the history, but when you read that type of history, and certainly in the textbooks, there's a great contribution by women, by Indian people, by African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Chinese Americans, all this great diversity in America. And we don't, I think, give enough attention to that. And certainly we don't give enough attention or credit to the many contributions of American Indians, naming rivers and states, and their heroes and their leaders, like Tecumseh, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Tecumseh in a different part of the country, in a different part of history, that Tecumseh is really regarded as a great leader.
I want to bring Neil Mangum in, who is the superintendent here, and we'll talk to him in just a second, but we'll take a call, and you might enjoy this call. The next call is from Richmond, Indiana. Richmond, Indiana, you're on the air. Go ahead, please. Hello, Richmond.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, you're on the air.
Oh, thank you. This is Hilda Neihart. I'm the daughter of John Neihart, who wrote Black Elk Speaks. Oh. And I was fortunate enough to be with him in 1931 in Manderson, South Dakota, when he interviewed Black Elk, and when Black Elk told his story. And it's unfortunate, I think, that so little is said of John Neihart, because the book is a work of art written by a great writer, and this is an American writer series, and you are showing John Neihart and Black Elk on the screen now. But Black Elk buttonholed my father to get him to tell the story, because he said, as Mr. Fixico referred a while ago to, that if his vision was true and mighty then, it is true and mighty still, and it was for all people.
Hilda Neihart, you live in Richmond, Indiana. How long have you lived there?
I'm here with my daughter now. I live in Bancroft, Nebraska, and Phoenix, Arizona most of the time, but I'm at my daughter's in Richmond, Indiana at the present time.
Was it your sister that did the stenography? Glad to have you with us. Was it your sister that did the stenography of what Black Elk had to say?
That's right. That's right. And it was quite a, you can imagine it was an interview something like pulling teeth, because Black Elk spoke Lakota, and his son Ben, who did the interpreting, had never heard the story before. It was all new to him. And of course, if Neihart had... Yes?
Where was the actual, where did Black Elk speak to your father?
It was at Black Elk's home, near about 4 miles west of Manderson. He lived in a one-room log cabin at the time. And that's where...
Manderson, South Dakota?
Manderson, South Dakota, and part of the time it was on Standing Bear's land. Standing Bear was a childhood friend of Black Elk's, and Black Elk didn't want to talk about his vision when people were around. You can imagine lots of people came, Indian people, came to listen, and he didn't want to talk about it in front of anybody. And after the book came out, of course, Black Elk was castigated by church people who said it was a heathen thing that he had said and a heathen thing that John Nyhart had written. But now they know better.
Well, hold on just a second. Don Fixico, have you ever met Hilda Nyhart?
No, but I would really like to, because I think what she has said.
Appreciate what you've been saying, because you obviously have a true understanding. And
well, I think.
Go ahead, Don Fixico.
Because what John Nyhart did and what Black Elk was able to do, for some particular reason, you know, that happened. Because when somebody has such a gift, and because of the personality in a young Black Elk at the time, being a humble person, hearing voices, that sometimes I think that when you hear the voices, that you tend to think that that's reality that you're a part of, and that's not the reality of everyone else. And are you going insane or what? And so here's an extraordinary opportunity for Black Elk to share his vision, and he did with a select few other people, of his own people, and they realized that how important it was. But when this type of experience tends to happen all the time, and at the closing of the 1800s, it was so extraordinary that he chose to share it with someone else. And maybe he didn't pick John Nyhart.
Well taken. He chose to do it. Because he felt, he said, I feel in this man beside me a great desire to know the things of the other world, and he has been sent so I can teach him. And my father...
Hilda Nyhart, how old were you when you were with your father
14.
when...
I was 14. And I was...
How much of it do you remember?
I remember very well. In fact, there's a little book that I wrote about our experiences. It's called Black Elk and Flaming Rainbow, because Black Elk named my father Flaming Rainbow, and the reason he gave when we were taken into the tribe is a very beautiful one. Would you like to
Thank you very much for calling us. Sure, read us a little bit.
Well, I'll just remember it. But he said, this world is like a garden, and over his words, he meant the poet's words. Somehow he knew my father was a poet. Over his words, they go like rain, and everything becomes a little greener. And he said, and after his words have passed, the poet's words, the memory of them shall stand long in the west like a flaming rainbow. So that's why he named John Nyhart Flaming Rainbow.
Thank you very much for calling us. It's nice to have you on the program. Hilda Nyhart, the daughter of John Nyhart. We didn't plan that. So
no, that was just wonderful. You know, one of my prized possessions, and I bought it when I was 13 years old, is a boxed volume of Song of the Indian Wars by John Nyhart, and it's inscribed, and still to this day, now it's 40-some years later, it's the most prized book in my collection. John Nyhart was just a great American poet.
Paul Hyde, we'll see you in a few minutes over under the tent.
All right.
Neil Mangum's with us, and we're going to take this call, though, before, if we still have the call from Fayetteville. Fayetteville, is it North Carolina?
Yes, sir. Yes,
You're on the air.
Okay. I'm pure Cherokee, and my bloodline is pure Cherokee. 2 points. I've been to that battlefield many times. It also honors the veterans because I think it's sectioned off by World War I, World War II, Korea, the Indian Wars, and in fact, I think there's some Civil War veterans there. My second point is this. I used to be a ardent supporter of the word Native American, and I was a Clovis First follower. But with all these new archaeological finds in Canada and South America, as an American Indian, I'm beginning to question our native status and our deliberate effort. It seems like to every time there's an archaeological find, we jump in there and say, this is a sacred burial ground. I think as a people, truth meant a lot to us. I think that we should pursue that truth and stop following the Clovis First opinions. That's all I have to say.
Neil, thank you. Neil Mangum, he started off by talking about this cemetery here. Do you want to follow up on what it really is?
Yes, it's the CUSTER Battlefield National Cemetery. It is a veteran cemetery from all wars. The first section that was brought here was veterans, actually the soldiers who died at the military posts in the Dakotas and the Montana and Wyoming were brought here at the closing of the frontier in the late 1880s and early 1890s. It has subsequently grown to include veterans from World War I, the Spanish-American War, World War II, Korea, and also the Vietnam conflict. And it is really, truly a marble brotherhood. Indian scouts are over here who served their country faithfully, and Indians, Native Americans who served in World War II in Vietnam. They are buried over here side by side. There are African Americans from the 10th U.S. Cavalry who are interred over here. So it really is a marble brotherhood.
Right to your right, we're looking at what?
You're looking out at the Little Bighorn battlefield, and the mission of the National Park Service is to preserve this intact as much as possible for the public who come here, and so that they can look at this battlefield much as it appeared at the time of the fight on June 25th, 1876.
What happened right there?
What happened right out here, if you see the white marble markers that go down between the trail there, they indicate where soldiers of the 7th Cavalry were killed and later buried on the spot where they had fallen. Later on, they were taken up to the top of the hill and placed in a mass grave at the base of the monument up there. Native Americans occupied the lower ridges and ravines and gullies, and as the soldiers came down, they engulfed them and killed them all as they were going down to what is called that portion of the battlefield, Deep Ravine.
How many soldiers were killed here?
About 210 soldiers under Custer's immediate command, the 5 companies that he had with him. There were 7 other companies that survived the 2 days of siege 5 miles away at the RENO BENTEEN defense site. And there were probably 60 Native Americans who were killed here defending their homeland.
How long have you been here?
I have been here 3.5 years as superintendent, and I served a stint for almost 9 years as chief historian back in the 1980s.
Where's your hometown originally?
My hometown originally is Petersburg, Virginia.
And how many people work for you here?
I have a permanent staff of about 13, and then we augment it in the summertime with seasonals till it grows to about 25.
And how many visitors a year do you get?
We get approximately 400,000 visitors a year.
We have a call for you from Billings, Montana. Hello, you're on the air.
Good morning. I am great grandson of Nicholas Black Elk and the great-great-grandson of Sitting Bull. In correction to the death of Black Elk, in 1953 is when he died, and he was 108 years old. And the other ironic thing is that they are doing a statue of Crazy Horse, but yet they have no pictures to go from because Crazy Horse never had his picture taken. And I thank you for your program. It is the best I've ever seen yet. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thanks for calling. And Don Fixico, there's a dispute about that picture.
Indeed, because Crazy Horse didn't want himself photographed. Indian people weren't familiar with photography at that point, as a lot of us are not maybe perhaps familiar with computers and websites and things like that. And so Crazy Horse felt like it was perhaps kind of taking something from him. And even though that sounds perhaps kind of silly, any of us who do anything, if you teach, you know, you're giving something of yourself to your students. If you're a politician, you're giving energy and sharing something of yourself to your audience, to your clients, etc. And that it's that kind of taking of something of yourself. And Crazy Horse, perhaps maybe in that kind of perspective, felt like that this was kind of taking something from him, taking something of his spirit, his spiritual energy, or something of that sort. And so when you think along that lines, then indeed perhaps it was not the best thing to be photographed.
But we do have a photograph of supposedly of Crazy Horse. Do you know the origin of that?
And supposedly too.
And it's just a supposedly. You don't believe it is a picture of him?
I would really kind of doubt it would be.
But we have a lot of photographs. I know Neil Mangum in your shop in here, a lot of photographs, Sitting Bull and
yes.
And what's the Curly, the scout?
Curly the Crow Scout for Custer. There were 6 Crow Scouts with Custer that day, and Curly gave what, in my judgment, was he gave the first details of the battle.
He's buried out over here.
He's buried out here in the National Cemetery, right in Section A. And there are a lot of Curly descendants on the reservation to this day, and in fact, we have a number of them that work for us.
Let's take a call from Bridgeport, Michigan. Hello there. You're on the air with Neil Mangum and Don Fixico.
Yes. Reason I'm calling, I have that book written by Herman Viola, and he made an interesting comment when he did an interview. Her name was Claudia Ironhawk Sully, and she stated that when she was a teenager, her grandfather took her to the battlefield, which the Sioux referred to it as the Battle of the Greasy Grass. And she made an interesting comment that he stated that when you look west toward the river bottom, that Custer actually didn't die on a hill, but that he died down by the river. And he said that because the Northern Cheyenne, I guess to this day, are so fearful of government retribution, they're real reluctant to tell about the battle. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that particular comment that she made.
Neil Mangum.
Well, the site of where Custer died, was killed, has been in dispute, and you can get as many interpretations as there are people to ask those questions. There are some accounts that Custer was killed at the ford, Medicine Tail Ford, which would have put him, that was the pivotal point in the Custer's approach to the Indian village, would have put him into the center of it or toward the northern end of it. And there are some accounts that a soldier matching Custer's description was shot and killed at the ford. Be that as it may, his body was found on top of Last Stand Ridge, where the memorial is today, clustered around about 41 other soldiers with him.
Maybe Bill can get a shot here as you turn and show exactly what you're talking about. And again, what do you call that up on top?
On top of at the very top of the hill there is the memorial to the 7th Cavalry who died at Little Bighorn. It is now overtopping mass grave for the 210 soldiers of Custer's immediate battalion.
And right on the other side of that, you intend to build this monument we were talking about earlier?
That's correct. To the left of the 7th Cavalry Memorial there, across the road, about 75 yards away, is where we intend to build an Indian memorial to commemorate the Indians who fell here at Little Bighorn defending their way of life.
See, that's $2.3 million is what the
It's $2.3 million. Legislation was passed in 1991 with the name change from Custer Battlefield National Monument to Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. It also authorized the construction of an Indian memorial but did not provide any appropriations for the building of it. And we've tried fundraising through the private sector and it hasn't really panned out. So at this point in time, the Senate has passed in their interior budget for FY02 $2.3 million. And so it's in the Senate bill. We'll have to wait and see whether it stays in the House.
We have a call for Neil Mangum, superintendent here at the National Monument from Fort Collins, Colorado. Hello, you're on the air.
Yes, thank you, C-SPAN. I'd like to ask the superintendent if he had any ideas of how the average American could help the plight of the Indians. Is there anything that the average person could do? Several years ago, I had the opportunity to travel around on several reservations throughout Nebraska and South Dakota. And it didn't take me too long to figure out that my stereotype, what I learned in history, was wrong. And I read a few books on it, and then I found that I looked at the reservations totally different. I looked at the monuments, and I became ashamed of being Caucasian. And I just wondered if the superintendent or maybe Don Fixico had some ideas of how we could help the future of the Native American.
Well, I think one of the ways is to energize the reservations by working with their economic tourism councils to generate jobs on the reservation. I think they need a lot of small businesses to come on the reservations, and I know working here with the Crow Reservation that surrounds the battlefield, that it's very nice to work with these folks to come up with businesses that they can own and operate, and that's one of the ways is to break the cycle of poverty, is to provide jobs. And I think investing in the American Indians on their reservations by providing those types of businesses will be one way to do that.
Standing where you are, right behind you, can you see is that tree line the Little Bighorn River?
Yes, it is. The tree lines that jut out into the valley there mark the Little Bighorn Valley, where the river is at. In fact, where those trees are is exactly where the Indian village of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse was located when Custer attacked it on the 25th of June.
Before I forget it, Don Fixico, Sitting Bull was killed where?
I'm not sure, and I'm going to think Neil's going to have to respond.
Sitting Bull was killed at his home. The Indian police from Standing Rock had come to arrest him.
Where?
On the Grand River, just inside the South Dakota border from North Dakota. He was killed before dawn. Only.
You know what year?
1890, December 15th, 1890.
So right near the Wounded Knee battle.
It's a little bit east of Wounded.
But I mean the same time frame, 1890.
Right, yeah. Wounded Knee will happen 2 weeks later.
And what were the circumstances that he was killed?
Sitting Bull was killed. He was under the Indian agent. McLaughlin wanted him arrested. He thought that Sitting Bull would be a bad influence, and the ghost dance craze that was going across the reservations. The military, or at least the Indian agents, they believed that there was going to be an outbreak, and Sitting Bull. They went to arrest Sitting Bull because they thought he would be involved in it. And Sitting Bull, as they were bringing him out of his cabin to go to Standing Rock to answer some questions by the Indian agent, the Indian police, who were in charge of arresting Sitting Bull, got into a fight with the backers of Sitting Bull, and a shot rang out. The Indian police was shot as he was crumpling to the ground. He pulled his gun into the chest of Sitting Bull and shot him, and then Red Tomahawk, another one of the Indian police, shot Sitting Bull in the back of the head. So it was over very quickly.
Brian, I'd like to add that it's a situation of Indian people fighting Indian people in that type of situation, and even more than that. I mean, when you talk about the tribal police who were sent to arrest Sitting Bull, and Sitting Bull really kind of stayed in his cabin for a length of time, and if he stayed in the cabin, and there's a couple of theories on this, because if he stayed in the cabin longer, then that meant more of his supporters would come and surround the tribal police who were sent to take him out. And you have all kind of kinship relations there, because some of them perhaps were related to Sitting Bull, some people who were supportive of Sitting Bull who were angry at the police were related to each other, and so it was not a very good situation at all with the death of Sitting Bull.
Next call, go to Clifton, Virginia. You're on the air with Neil Mangum and Don Fixico.
Good morning, Brian. Thank you very much for this superb program. My question is for Professor Fixico. I hear both terms being used this morning, Native American and Indian, and could he say something about what Native peoples themselves prefer to be referred as, and secondly, could he also say something about why the white Europeans were so dreadfully fearful of this Native ceremony, the ghost dance?
Thanks.
Well, first of all, I think that in the United States that the more preferred term is American Indians. It seems that people who are less familiar with American Indian people, they tend to refer to American Indians as Native Americans. And people who now are being born in the United States, born in America, are referring to themselves as Native Americans. So in a sense, American Indians have kind of lost a claim to Native Americans. People who are not Indian people can call themselves Native Americans. In Canada, people call themselves First Nations, First Peoples, and so it's really kind of, I think, if you're in Canada or whether you're in the United States, Indian people among ourselves, we really refer to ourselves according to our tribal affiliation, the Indian nation that we tend to identify with. And I think I forgot the other part of what was asked.
Well, I forgot it myself. Maybe catch up in our second part. We were going to talk to Kitty DEERNOSE in the next segment. What does she do for you?
Kitty Bell DEERNOSE is a curator of our museum here. And she's been working here for just about 15 years. I knew her when I was back here in the 80s. She's one of the best curators we have in the National Park Service.
American Indian.
American Indian, yeah.
What, for those who've never been here, let's go over quickly the details. Where are we?
Well, we're standing just about 100 yards down from what is called Last Stand Hill, where Custer and about 40 men shot their horses for breastworks and fought out the last stages of the Battle of Little Bighorn. And
where are we in the state of Montana?
We're in southeastern Montana, on the Crow, surrounded by the Crow Indian Reservation, the Crow Agency. We're about 17 miles from Hardin, Montana, and about 65 miles from Billings, Montana.
How many people live on the Crow Indian Reservation?
About 7,000.
You happen to know, and maybe Don Fixco knows, how many Indian tribes there are in the United States?
Federally recognized? Right now there are 562 federally recognized tribes.
And from all the visitors you get in a year's time, almost 500,000 visitors, what's the one question almost everybody asks when they come here?
Besides where the bathroom is at, they asked where the Indian village is located and where did Custer die. And where's the Indian Memorial?
And what kind of shape is this place in compared to what it was 20 years ago? What's happening in the Park Service and the monument here?
Well, it is a lot more. I can truthfully say that the battlefield is a lot more inclusive rather than exclusive of telling a complete story, a story from the perspective of the American Indians who fought here and from the soldiers who fought here. At one time, the battlefield was very dominant in telling the story of the 7th Cavalry and Custer, and now we've changed that over the years. You can look at National Park Service literature and how it changed. It's no longer just the advancement of westward civilization. It was now the Indians fighting for their way of life as well. We've changed our exhibitry in the museum to be more reflective of the time and to be more balanced in telling a truthful, balanced story.
Where'd you get your education?
I got my education at Virginia State University, MA under Dr. Paul Hutton at the University of New Mexico.
So you went to school under Professor Hutton, our guest here?
Yes, I did.
Neil Mangum, thank you for having us here, and you can help me introduce this break because a couple of days ago on June 24th, you had the reenactment.
Right.
Where was that done?
There were 2 reenactments done in the communities here. The Reelbird family down here at Medicine Tail Ford, about 2 miles below us here on the Little Bighorn, do a reenactment on the 22nd to the 24th of June, and then the community of Hardin, the Hardin Area Chamber of Commerce, puts on a reenactment on the other side of Hardin. So there are actually 2 reenactments going on simultaneously.
We'd like to thank the Reelbird family for allowing us to be there for this event. Here's our break, and thanks again to you for allowing us to come here.
Well, thank you.
Shot and killed here at the Medicine Hill Police Complex. His body floated down the river, and his men were scattered. On the west bank, the east bank. Medicine Hill Coulee crossing that day was in chaos. A battle was going on. Our blood was hot that day, according to Gall, who lost his 2 women and his children as they were going across up into the hilltop. Sumo said that it was like a fast shooting. Pop, pop, we shoot. Pop, pop, we shoot again. Then we ride again. We go like stones, swirling stones, water swirling around stones. We go around and round, killing them left and right. Gall said that he did not use his weapon, the little pistol and the big rifle. He said that I used the hatchet to bury them at the Calhoun Hill. And it goes on and on. Warriors, Crazy Horse would go in front of the retreating forces of Company I and C going up towards Custer Hill. They would retreat and they are surrounded, and they would be killed. This tactical disintegration. And some of them in fear, they would shoot down into the ground or up into the air. C Company, it would be a domino factor. As C Company falls, L Company falls. I Company falls, and on it would fall, all the way to Custer Hill. And there was so much dust, so much gunpowder smoke that you witnessed here, that soon the silhouette of the horses, much of the dust that would follow through. Even at the day of the battle here, the scouts, the Rickarod scouts, would wear red arms around their bands to see that they would be friendly Indians. But it didn't matter, as the warriors, even they would kill their own comrades on that day, going through walking, and lame white man will be killed by their own comrades on the day of the battle here. As if some of you would travel through up there, they would see their markers. Many of these warriors would wear the blue coats of these soldiers. Some of them are stripped. And from a distance of about a couple miles to the south of us there on Weir Point, 2 companies would see at the battle site there that they thought that Custer would win this battle, but no, it was not to be. As these warriors, with the flags, the get-on flags that they call them, they would be wearing them, and they would be celebrating the aftermath. They said it took only about 20 to 35 minutes of this so-called Custer massacre, and they would come back victorious.
This weekend, appointment viewing on Book TV starts Saturday at 8 a.m. and again at noon Eastern with children's books. Folk singer Pete Seeger and co-author Paul Du Bois Jacobs tell stories from their book, Pete Seeger's Storytelling Book, and lead the audience in a sing-along. On Public Lives, Saturday at 8 p.m. and Sunday at 11 p.m., Jeffrey Perret discusses his biography of John F. Kennedy, titled Jack, A Life Like No Other. On History on Book TV, Saturday at 11 p.m. and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, Stephen Hayward discusses The Age of Reagan, 1964 to 1980, the fall of the old liberal order. And on Encore Book Notes, Sunday at 11 a.m., author and former drama critic Frank Rich discusses his book Ghost Light. Explore non-fiction books all weekend on Book TV, only on C-SPAN 2. And online at booktv.org. Join Book TV Sunday, January 6th for In-Depth Cornel West. 3 hours of conversation and your opportunity to call Harvard professor, musician, and the author of Race Matters, The African American Century, Keeping Faith, Philosophy, and Race in America, and the Cornel West Reader. You can also talk to him about his new CD, Sketches of My Culture.
Brother Medgar, leader of quiet dignity and undeniable determination, fighting for black people to gain the right to vote in gut bucket Mississippi within apartheid America.
In Depth, Cornel West, live Sunday, January 6th at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. In-depth interviews are the first Sunday of the month. Upcoming guests include Tom Clancy in February, Peggy Noonan in March, and Robert Caro in April. All on Book TV, on C-SPAN 2.
We'll return to the second part of the program from Little Bighorn Battlefield National Park in just a moment. But first, some background information on Black Elk, who at age 13 was present at the Battle of Little Bighorn.
Lakota Sioux spiritual leader Black Elk was born at Little Powder River in Wyoming in December of 1863. He died at the age of 86 on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Black Elk told his life story to John Neihart in 1930, who then published it as Black Elk Speaks 2 years later. Herbert Hoover was the president in 1932, and the population was about 123.5 million, of which only 1/3 were American Indians. The Plains Indian conflicts escalated over 30 years. There were many battles, including the massacre at Sand Creek, the Plains War, and the Red Clouds War, which continued over 2 years. The Battle of Little Bighorn was in 1876, followed by the Wolf Mountain Battle, and then the Wounded Knee Massacre 13 years later. The most complete American Indian statistics are from the 1990 census. The population count was nearly 2 million, and there were 550 federally recognized tribes speaking 250 tribal languages. There were 275 reservations covering 56 million acres, and the median household income was about $20,000. In a moment, we'll return to the Little Bighorn battlefield for part 2 of this week's American Writer Series.
Don Fixico, what relevance does this monument have to American history?
It tells us very much a part of what America is about, in that America, because it's such a young country that grew so fast, there are points in American history and the American experience of conflict, competition, competition for resources and things of that sort. And when that competition takes place, you know, at a very aggressive level, then one people has to be subordinated, a nation has to be defeated, and these were actually were Indian nations. And so when that happens, there also has to be a healing process. And American history, including all people, is such a vibrant history that we have these competitions and conflicts for land, building, and healing. And the American experience, at least in my perspective, is one of these types of contest and healing and contest and healing. It's a very much of a recycling process, and because of that, we're such a building nation.
Put this into context, Paul Hutton. Where is this in the history of the United States? What part of the country are we in, and how did this all happen?
Well, in 1876, it was the far western frontier, the very edge of white settlement, land that was claimed by the Sioux and the Crow both. It was part of the Crow Indian Reservation at the time through the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The United States government wanted to force Sioux bands back onto their reservation in South Dakota. And Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry were out here to do the bidding of the government.
Black Elk Speaks, this small paperback that I have in my hand, plays what role in the history of all this, Don Fixico?
Black Elk Speaks tells us much of an inside point of view, which it's really the indigenous voice being heard, which was started in 1932 but wasn't heard very well. And it was heard again in 1961 and then 1971. And it took that many times for it to be heard, because when we look at American history or the American experience overall, it's really in terms of relationships, men and women, Indians and whites, African Americans and whites, African Americans and Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, etc. And we don't really listen to the other side, and I think that's one of the difficulties in teaching with America, that we don't listen enough, and this is the inside point of view.
Governmental policy in the United States today regarding the American Indian.
Well, it's moved toward a new policy of self-determination. In the 1950s, it was the policy of termination, the idea to do away with the Indian reservations, mainstream Indian people into the rest of American society. But we're really seeing a revitalization of tribal governments and a new power coming into Indian country as a result of Indian gaming.
Paul Hutton teaches at the University of New Mexico, Don Fixico at the University of Kansas. They'll be with us for another 45 minutes as we wrap up our stop here near Hardin on Route I-90. This is the Custer, I never can get it right because I'm used to the old Custer National Cemetery or the Custer National Park. It's the Custer, you can tell.
It's now the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, and it is still the Custer National Cemetery, a veteran cemetery right by the battlefield.
Let's take a call from Mercer, Virginia. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, since the arrival of Columbus, over 500 years now, and the Holocaust of the American, Native American peoples throughout the Americas, at this point, incidentally, the American, Native American peoples were ahead practically in every field of the Europeans except in transport and weaponry at that time, and in every field, and still ahead, like Native American medicine is still being gathered up by corporate America and used. At this point, it seems like Native Americans are going to be the majority, at least the plurality in the United States. We already are in most South American and Middle American countries at this point. And I think we need to reassert ourselves in a new kind of development which incorporates all of the experiences of Native Americans throughout the Americas.
What do you say, Don Fixico?
I think that there is an Indian presence, an indigenous voice, that it's always been there, but we haven't really paid much attention to it. And that in the forthcoming decades, that when problems become more difficult to answer, and especially as we tax our natural resources, that we'll be looking in different directions and towards different sources for answers to these difficult problems. And if you can solve a problem from more than one perspective, I think that's really kind of ingenious. And I think we're going to have to do that in the coming decades.
Seattle, Washington, you're on the air.
Yes, I have a few comments. First, I have the comment that the fact Custer was in the Black Hills looking for gold. He was doing the bidding of the United States government, but he was there to steal the gold that had been discovered in the Black Hills. And the Black Hills had been given to the Native American people. And as a Sioux, I find it a little disheartening that the facts are just what, the government wants to say. And if you ask any Sioux, they'll tell you they were there to steal from us. They promised us the land as long as the wind would, the wind would blow, the grass would grow, and the water flows. And I can see behind you in the Black Hills and in the land of South Dakota, there's grass growing, the water is there, and the wind is probably blowing at times. And that land is still not ours. It was promised to us. They've taken it. They've never given it back.
Thanks, caller. Paul Hutton.
No question about it. The policy of the United States government was to get the land of the Indians. What happened in the late 19th century is that many of the treaties that were made, including the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, which is so key to the question of the Black Hills, were made by the government for expediency. They thought they had more time to solve the so-called Indian question. Well, because of the influx of immigrants, they weren't going to have that time. Keep in mind that every year in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, more immigrants were coming into the United States than all the Indians that lived in the United States at that time. And so there was just an onslaught of people moving forward, an aggressive industrial nation on the cusp of world power was expanding. It was going to take over the entire continental United States. It was absolutely obsessed with union as a result of the Civil War and with having its will felt everywhere. They took the Black Hills, and they were stolen from the Sioux, no question about it.
She called from Seattle. Who was Chief Seattle, do you know?
And Chief Seattle was in that part of the country that, he's regarded as really kind of a philosopher, a native philosopher, and
you know what tribe he was in?
Suquamish, I believe.
I'm going to read a passage from Black Elk Speaks. He referred constantly to whites with the word, I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. What is it? Is it Wasatchews?
Yes.
That's the way you pronounce it? Oh, right on the first pass. Let me read a little bit. This is from Black Elk Speaks, where he again spoke to what person?
John Neihart.
When?
In the 1920s.
Published?
1931, I believe.
Whenever we went, now let me read this again. Wherever we went, the soldiers came to kill us, and it was all our own country. It was ours already with the Wasatchews, made the treaty with Red Cloud that said it would be ours as long as grass should grow and water flow. That was only 8 winters before, and they were chasing us now because we remembered and they forgot. Let's go to Wofford City, North Dakota. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Hi, my name is Deanna Parisian, and I'm a Mandan and Hidatsa Indian from the Fort Berthold Reservation, and I'm an Indian educator. And one of the things that I find in working with high school students and students K-12 and beyond, I suppose, is the big misconception and the lack of understanding about treaty rights. And the caller before me, I see, was talking about treaty rights, or the treaties that the United States government, the federal government, made with Indian tribes. And one of the things that I strongly give to my children is the treaty rights, that we can never forget them. Being a full-blood Indian, it's our right. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions, I believe, to education, health, and welfare. I'd like one of the guests to comment on that, please.
Don Fixico.
Yes, indeed. You're quite right, because these are rights. When treaties are signed, we're really talking about an agreement that both sides are supposed to respect. That in international law, the concept is one sovereign signing with another sovereign, make an agreement. And just because one side tries to abrogate that, then that does not necessarily null and void that agreement. There are 389 ratified United States Indian treaties and agreements. Some scholars say there are 371, but most of these have been disregarded by the United States government, obviously for reasons like war and the rush for land and natural resources and things like that. But indeed, these are rights, and it's these treaty rights that make American Indians, and we are a minority, but it gives us some distinction because no other minorities have signed treaties with the United States government.
Live Oak, California, you're on the air next. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm very happy to meet you, enjoying your show. Perhaps Mr. Hutton might be able to answer this. I tried to get through earlier. In regards to the mass grave at the memorial, is there any reason for the mass grave other than individual? Was it due to composition, etc., of the bodies? Could you possibly answer that?
Now, is the mass grave right behind you on the hillside?
The mass grave is right behind us.
Right over your right shoulder, and we see it on camera.
Indeed, it's almost exactly where Custer fell, and of course the hill was flattened, and Custer's marker was moved down the hill a little bit. The individual tombstones are where soldiers fell. They're not really graves. All of the bones of the soldiers were gathered up and interred in a common mass grave right after the battle. And of course, immediately after the battle, burial parties were sent out from the troops that came in and saved Reno and Benteen, but they were in a big hurry to get out of this part of the country, and essentially they just put some sagebrush and a little dirt over the decomposing bodies.
Is Reno the Reno of Reno, Nevada?
No, he is not.
Not the same guy?
Not the same man.
What rank was he here?
He was a major here. He had been a general in the volunteer army during the Civil War, and he's buried about 150 yards from us.
Champaign, Illinois, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm a doctoral student in education at the University of Illinois. I'd like to recommend a couple of sources for teachers and parents who are interested in helping their children have a better view of Native Americans in today's society. The first one is called Through Indian Eyes. It's available from a website called oyate.org. Oyate is spelled O-Y-A-T-E.org. They also have a number of books there for children that feature today's Native authors writing about today's children. Among them is one called Rain Is Not My Indian Name. The author is Cynthia Latich Smith. And the third resource that I'd like to recommend is for teachers and school librarians is Fred Hoxie's Encyclopedia on the North American Indian, which is very concise and very accessible to elementary and public school audience and readers of that age.
And thank you for calling. I want to also add that at AmericanWriters.org, Meg Steele has done lesson plans for people that are using this program. They can also go on there and find the first chapter of many of the books that we've featured on this show. And we also have books that you two gentlemen have written. Don Fixico, what's this book, The Invasion of Indian Country in the 20th Century? When did you write that?
That was, when you write books, it takes several years for you to get it and for it to come out. And I think I was year before last. That's not my most recent book. The most recent book was on the urban Indian experience in America. But I thought this was a relevant book, for this television show because it talks about natural resources and various case studies in America, and how that these different natural resources are being protected by the tribes in various types of strategies.
And here's a book by Paul Hutton, Phil Sheridan and His Army. When did this come out and what's in it?
It was published in 1985. This is a new edition just brought out by the University of Oklahoma Press last year. Sheridan was the Army General in command in the West throughout all the Indian Wars, and so it is a story of the Indian Wars, a biography of Sheridan, and a history of the Army, an institutional history of the Army during that time.
San Jose, California, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Randy Lamb, this is Talking Masood from San Jose. My question is this, how old are the American Indian civilizations in America? And is it possible that they have a connection with a 5,000-year-old civilization in Pakistan, which is called Harappa and Mohenjo-daro civilizations? Could it be that before Columbus, the Indians migrated? And I'll take my answer.
Don Fixico?
There are different types of migration theories, and one is literally of continental drift. And if the continents were much closer together, then indeed there would be similarities of cultures and civilizations sharing traits. Another idea is multigenesis, that indeed that a culture started here and over different parts of the world and so forth. But I would think, too, at certain times that they would have to kind of develop things, ideas and philosophies and technology at the same time, and again, the similarities. But when you look at the basic beliefs of what people believe in, truth and soul and things like that, then there are indeed some similarities. And when people are close to the earth, no matter what culture or civilization, I think you're going to come up with a lot of parallels.
Romney, West Virginia, you're on the air. You're next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. I have a call for Mr. Hutton and also for Professor Don. And the first would be Mr. Hutton, Lewis and Clark Museum out in St. Louis. There was mention also of smallpox and all being passed on through the clothes from some of the people to some of the reservations to just literally just get rid of the tribal people themselves in the reservations. And then Mr. Don, the question to you, sir, would be, I have a picture of my great-great-grandmother who supposedly in the picture really confirms that she's pure-blooded Cherokee, and I was wondering what I would need to do in order to check on my ancestry on that, or do I need to go to the American Indian Association there in D.C. to see what rights I have, or, just get involved in some tribal stuff? And I thank you both.
Don Fixico, we'll start with you.
Contact the tribe. The Cherokee tribe in Oklahoma has a library, has some archives, and related to that would be the Oklahoma Historical Society. One can begin with that, and especially with the Dawes rules, because if you have a possible tribal member who accepted a land allotment, then indeed there would be government records of that.
Well, indeed, there was the transfer of European diseases in the Indian population, and it was horrific in terms of its impact. Not just smallpox, which was one of the worst, but measles, mumps, all of these diseases Indian people had no immunity to. And of course, this disease frontier actually moved ahead of the settlement frontier and came with fur trappers and traders, and so it tended to devastate tribes. In fact, the Sioux became so powerful because they lived out on the plains and managed to miss the diseases that ravaged the Mandan, the Hidatsa, the other Missouri River tribes. There is one documented case of smallpox being sent amongst the tribes on purpose. That was Jeffrey Amherst back in 1763, a British general. There's no biological warfare that was conducted by the United States Army during the Indian Wars.
Kitty DEERNOSE is a museum curator here at the Visitor Center, and she's inside, and we're going to talk to her for a couple of minutes. What do you have inside there that the visitors can see when they come here to this monument?
Well, when you come into the Visitor Center, what we have here is the observation room, which overlooks the Custer battlefield, where George Armstrong Custer and his 5 companies of 210 men fought and died. This observation room shows on the walls a collection of ledger drawings from the Thomas Marcus collection. And just to tell you a little bit about Dr. Marcus, he was a physician who was assigned to the Northern Cheyenne Indian Agency in 1922, and he lived until 1935. But he had the good fortune of working with the Northern Cheyenne and also interacting with them and documenting their accounts of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Many of them were veterans of the battle. They included people like Big Beaver, who is shown here in this photograph. And you can see him with 2 of his ledger drawings. And then we see Dr. Marcus on the right, interviewing Wooden Leg on the left there. And then over on this panel, you can see Shoulder Blade. And also below him is Wooden Leg, also Northern Cheyenne. And these individuals became friends of Dr. Marcus. Dr. Marcus, as I mentioned, had the good fortune to interact with them. He documented their accounts through his writings and also through photography. And also, he encouraged them to document their accounts of the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
Kitty DEERNOSE, let me ask you about names. Your last name, where does that come from?
My last name is DEERNOSE. I'm Crow. My grandfather's name was Uchaba, which translated into English means deer nose.
And how do Indians get all the different names? And there's a lot of, they come out of battles. I mean, you can help us better understand. At what point do you get the different names?
Okay. In the case of the Crow tribe, which is the tribe that I'm from, names well, say in the 1800s, names were very individual and they were acquired through deeds, or maybe relatives gave young children names. But in the, say, the reservation era, a lot of the tribal members from my tribe were given individual names as surnames and then given Christian names. For an example, my grandfather, his name was Uchaba, and then they turned it into English DEERNOSE and gave him the Christian name John. And then subsequently, my mother's family took the name DEERNOSE. Today, we have naming ceremonies that do occur within the Crow tribe, and names are given to young children or young adults, or even adults who need an Indian name, and they're usually given to them by a clan relative. And a lot of these names are derived either through maybe the namer might have dreamt of a name, or maybe the namer had an experience maybe in a battle, maybe in the Vietnam War, and had an experience that was so significant in their life that they decided that when somebody would come to them, that would be one of the names they would make available to an individual. And in the Crow tribe, when we are named by our relatives, we usually honor them by giving them gifts, and it's customary among the Crow to give at least 4 different items to the person who's naming you.
We'll come back in just a second. Let's go to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho for our next caller. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yeah, it's been my experience that the federal government has lied to the Native peoples ever since they come and started taking our land. And, you know, I just don't see the government trying to atone for that, trying to keep the treaties, trying to do anything. And I just don't see the big deal about what you're trying to do here. You know, if you're not going to keep your promises, then don't make them.
Katie DEERNOSE, you work for the federal government. What's your reaction to a call like that?
Well, I've been working for the federal government here at the National Monument since 1985, and you know, 5 years of that time I worked as an interpreter of the battle and also of Plains Indian history and culture, particularly about the tribes who were here at the Little Bighorn, and that includes the Lakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and then also interpreting this battle from the Crow Indian Scout involvement and also the Arikara involvement in this battle as scouts. Working for the federal government, you know, I guess I've been working within the National Park Service, and I guess my experience with this federal agency is that the Park Service is making efforts to, well, at this site particularly, to incorporate Native American perspectives in interpretation. And as a matter of fact, when I came here in 1985, I was recruited as part of a genre of people who were encouraged, Native peoples who were encouraged to come to this site to bring their perspectives to this site. Of course, the perspectives are based on historic Indian accounts. The National Park Service, in the 15 years that I've worked for them, has been very good for me, and I've had a wonderful time working with the federal government on that level.
Where were you educated?
The Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and received my museum studies from there.
We need to take a call from Skaneateles, New York. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Sutton to describe the conditions for the ordinary soldier out in the plains, and what kind of shape were the troops in when the battle did finally take place. I'll hang up and listen. Thanks.
Thanks. That's the second time we've had that incorrect name for you. Paul Hutton is his name, and maybe we have the wrong name on the screen. Anyway, go ahead, Mr. Hutton.
Life for the average soldier in the far west was pretty miserable. In fact, I was just down in southern Arizona 2 days ago near Fort Huachuca and Fort Grant, and I was really pondering just how awful life was. The alcoholic rate among the Frontier Army was very, very high. And I can understand that. You would understand why people drank so much. Many of these men were uneducated. Many of them were right off the boat. It's one of the great ironies of the struggle here at the Little Bighorn that so many of the soldiers who fought and died here were immigrants who had only recently come to America, and they're fighting for the United States government against people whose ancestors have been here for hundreds, thousands of years. fighting over this piece of land here out in the wilds of Montana. It was a pretty tough life indeed. And the soldiers, when they got here, were very tired. In fact, some fortunate soldiers' horses gave out, and they had to go back and they joined Reno and BENTEEN, and so they weren't with Custer. He had forced march his men. He wanted to get here first. He was a young man in a hurry. He didn't know what he was hurrying to.
The book for this particular Stop for Our series is Black Elk Speaks, and Black Elk was here during this battle, as we learned earlier, when he was 13 years old. Our next call is from Malibu, California. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm the most recent past president of the Custer Battlefield and Historical Museum Association. I've been involved with the battlefield for 25 years. And one of the things I called in about was to take exception to the remarks of Superintendent Neil Mangum. He's a wonderful superintendent and a wonderful friend that I've known almost from the day that I went to the battlefield the first time. But he was talking about balance in the program, and it has swung too far in the other direction. Now, while it's true that for many, many years it was all concentrated on the cavalry, and the Indians were pretty much ignored, and that there was a correction necessary, but now there has been an overcorrection. An example is that on June 25th, the National Park Service program, which started at 6 in the morning and finished about 6 or 7 in the evening, out of the perhaps 10 or 12 items on the program, 2 and only 2 involved the cavalry, and not just exclusively the cavalry. Those 2 dealt with the Indians and the cavalry. All the rest of it was strictly for the Indians.
Thanks for your call. Kitty Deernos, you probably heard that call, and I know that it wasn't directed at you, but what do you do about when people accuse you of not being balanced in the presentation here? What's your response?
I think that when you look at the administrative history of this site, that well, from the time of the battle, from 1876 until 1940, this site was administered by the War Department. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't until 1940 that the National Park Service assumed jurisdiction over this site. One of the earlier superintendents under the National Park System was from the 7th U.S. Cavalry. And he was an administrator up until the 1950s. Now, the Park Service did a self-study in the 1970s, and this self-study determined that the interpretation at this site was a little bit biased, and it was a little bit heavy on the military side. And in 1974, 75, 76, the National Park Service made an effort to try to bring a more balanced perspective to this site. So going back to the 70s, the National Park Service has recruited Native American people from the tribes who were in this battle, including myself, Crow, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, to come to the site to interpret their stories. Now, I think that over the years, we've seen a balance. In the 70s, I think the balance between the military and the Native American perspectives balanced out. And then when we went into the 1990s, we had more Native interpreters at the site, and I think it would be natural because at that point in time, we had a Native American superintendent by the name of Barbara Boer, now called Barbara Satir, and her successor was Gerard Baker, who's a member of the Mandan Hidatsa tribes of North Dakota. And I think with those 2 Native administrators at this site, it was very natural for Native Americans or American Indians to come to the site, to meet our superintendents, to interact with them, and it gave more and more Native peoples an opportunity to have some input into this site. This site today is a place for all Americans. It's not just for the military, it's not just for the military buffs, the military historians, This place is user-friendly today. It's for all Americans. And
let me interrupt because we are running out of time, and I know you have to go downstairs to show us the archives. But before you do that, can we have the camera swing around and show us the room you're in, and just give us 30 seconds as to what else people can see in there?
We're in the exhibit hall at the Visitor Center. We receive about 400,000 visitors here annually. We get local, regional, international visitors. We have our firearms on exhibit. We have archaeological specimens on exhibit, and we also have items from the Custer collection on display. Behind me, we also have People of the Plains exhibit, which features material from the Lakota and the Cheyenne. And the material in this case, a lot of it was acquired from the Battle of Slim Buttes, which occurred in September 9th of 1876, just a few months after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Captain Anson Mills struck a village of American Horse with about 37 lodges and took many items from the village. And at the same time, you know, the troopers took a lot of things from the village, including utilitarian items, about 2,000 robes from elk, buffalo, deer, antelope hides, and also about 5,000 pounds of dried meat. But this Slim Buttes encampment was connected to the Little Bighorn. They found in that village a swallowtail guidon, which we'll see downstairs when we go into our collections area.
I'm going to let you go downstairs because we only have 15 minutes left. I want to get a couple calls in, and we'll see you in just a second. Kauai, Hawaii, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. Another terrific program on C-SPAN. Just have a comment and a question. I live in Hawaii. Hawaiian people were another indigenous people who were severely affected by the arrival of the haole or foreigner to their lands. My question is, did the Native American Indians know they were going after Custer? Did they realize this was George Armstrong Custer that they were fighting? And if they did, how do they know it was General Custer? I understand that all of his officers wore buckskins. Is that true or not? And would they have known that they were killing General Custer at the time? Thank you.
Thanks. Don Fixico?
I really think that they knew that Custer was coming to them. That perhaps through Black Elk, through Sitting Bull was also a visionary too, that they knew that he was going to come. And because perhaps the earlier campaigns that Custer waged against them, that he was coming to them. I think they already had some insight to that.
We're going to show another clip of Charlotte Black Elk, the great-granddaughter of Black Elk, after this call from Worland, Wyoming. Go ahead, please. You're on the air, Worland.
Good morning. Jim Legg from over in the Bighorn Basin here in Wyoming. Excellent program. Stayed home from work to watch it. Quickly, I'm not a writer or a historian, but I did live on the Pine Ridge from 1966 to 76. And in fact, my youngest son has a master's degree from the University of South Dakota under Dr. Hoover in federal Indian policy. Charlotte is coming up. In fact, when I first went to Pine Ridge, I taught a couple of years there, and Charlotte was one of the students there at Oglala Community School. Later, after I taught there, served as liaison between the tribe and the National Park Service up at Badlands, and Ben Rifle, Rosebud Sioux, was my mentor. My comment, and as a result of my son's studies in American Indian history, and I am familiar with both of your guest writings and excellent books and excellent works, but maybe they would comment on Francis Paul Pruka's books, especially The Great Father. My son gave that to me and introduced me to that book, and I feel like I'm the one that maybe has got the master's degree out of his work. And like I said, appreciate stayed home from work to watch this excellent program, understanding Native American history, the history, and even what's going on now. Is very not only confusing but controversial, and you're doing an excellent job in portraying that. Thank you.
Dr. Paul Hutton.
It's ironic. Don and I over dinner last night were talking about Paul Pruka and some ways that we want to honor him through the Western History Association, which is an organization we're both very active in. One of the great historians of American Indian policy really is provided us with the bedrock books that all of us who study Indian history have have used upon which to build our foundation.
John Fixico, can you read us a little more, just a little more of Black Elk from Black Elk Speaks? This was spoken to John Neihardt back in 1928, 29, 30, in those years. What did Black Elk say?
It was the pictures I remembered and the words that went with them, for nothing I had ever seen with my eyes were so clear and bright as what my vision showed me, and no words that I'd ever